Good evening. As Dan mentioned, what we have for you tonight is basically it's a status update of the parking study. This reflects a lot of the field work that we completed back in June, and what we have is a scope of work that is in response to an RFP that the village put out. One of those things is inventory existing parking, conduct parking counts. We did this back in June. We did online customer surveys of visitors, metro commuters, downtown residents, employees, business owners, each of those various groups. One of the steps that we will be providing will be calculating the parking demand by land use. That will be forthcoming, so we do not have information on that tonight. We'll be looking at best practices in comparison to some other communities. Again, there are some issues that we'll point out in our presentation tonight, but we don't have a lot of the best practices or comparison information yet. Parking allocation, how you should be doing that. So there's a number of items that have been asked, and what we have for you tonight is the survey results from some of these other groups, discussion of the parking supply. We have quantified and qualified that, the results of the turnover and occupancy studies, and I'll get into that in a moment. We have calculated the demand. One of the specific requirements of the RFP was the demand for the Tivoli Theater, and we have some information on that. And then what we also have for you is some photographs of just some of the things that we noticed during our field work when we were here in June. One of the questions that was asked on the online survey is the purpose of folks coming downtown. We looked at, they ranked these as their various reasons. And when we ranked these, work was obviously one of the most frequent reasons. Coming downtown for services, shopping, dining, other which could be library, might have been there, medical appointments, entertainment, and special events. One of the other questions we asked is, why do you avoid coming downtown? Number one reason, parking. There's a number of folks that indicated that they find parking difficult, and as we get into this, you'll see some of those results. We also asked folks their opinion on various statements. On the question, is it easy to locate an on-street space? Folks tended to disagree with that. They find that a little bit frustrating. Is it easy to locate a general parking space? Again, they tended to disagree with that statement, indicating they have some issues with trying to be able to find parking. The parking signs, the directional, locational, they seem to agree that those are easy to follow. We do have some examples where we think that is a little confusing, and so that comment confused us a little bit. But another one of the things that we found in the surveys pointed out was the time limits that we have for the on-street parking. The 2-hour, the 3-hour seem to be reasonable for most folks to be able to get their business concluded. The defined study area went within the dotted line, orange line here, from Franklin down to Maple, around Village Hall, and then over to Carpenter Street. A lot of that is residential, so we just looked at the quantity of parking along those spaces. A lot of those are 4-hour time-limited spaces. Now, we have a very specific definition of parking. Public parking is that which is available regardless of your destination. Unlike a private business owner where the parking is for parking at his business, when your business is concluded, you're generally expected to move your car to go on to your next destination. In public parking, you can park there and visit multiple destinations. So that is really what facilitates a pedestrian-friendly environment, the quantity of public parking that you have. Now, one of the things that we found is we did inventory the parking supply, and a benchmark or a best practice for us is that a community should control 50%, a minimum of 50% of the parking within the downtown. In Downers Grove, you're nearly 53% of the parking is publicly available, and that contains the on-street spaces, the various commuter lots, the parking garage, and all that. So you are above the best practices overall. What we found, though, is the public parking on the north of the tracks, you're a little deficient. It's only about 40.5% to 41% of the parking north of the tracks is publicly available, and it's nearly 58% of the parking. I think a large part of that is the parking garage on the south side of the tracks. We did quantify all the parking within the downtown, and I'm sure you won't be able to read this map, but the areas in red are the Privately controlled spaces off-street within the downtown, and the areas in green are the publicly controlled spaces within the downtown. Yellow are the various on-street spaces. Most of those are 2-hour time limited. Now, we conducted what we call turnover and occupancy counts, and we conducted this on Thursday, June 16th, and Saturday, June 18th. These ran from 6 in the morning until 11 o'clock at night. They were run hourly. There was 2 teams of us. I was in one vehicle with a teammate, and we had another vehicle going through. And what we did is, in the on-street spaces, we recorded license plate numbers, and so we came back once an hour and we see where those spaces turning over. In many of the off-street spaces, we just came by, particularly the commuter lots, came by once per hour and see what the occupancy was of each of those parking areas were. We did separate the results for both north side and south side, and we also analyzed the on-street spaces, as I mentioned, for turnover. Now, overall, what we found is of the 3,065 spaces that we did analyze, at peak time, we found about 2,200 of those were occupied, and this is combined north and south of the tracks. And that peak was occurring right around 12 o'clock in the afternoon. When we break the results down for the north of the tracks, out of the 847 spaces that we analyzed on that side, we found about 530 of those were occupied. On the south side of the tracks, out of the 2,200, we found about 1,700 were occupied at peak time. And again, that was about 12 o'clock in the afternoon. This shows the peak hour occupancy, and it's a composite because we did find there was a difference between the north side and the south side of the tracks. So it is looking at what the peak hour was on the north side of the tracks. And just to kind of explain this, the areas in red are the areas that we found that the parking occupancy during that peak hour was in excess of 85% occupied, 85% of the spaces. Now that number is significant because it is perceptually, that is the number, the percentage that folks feel that there is a parking issue. There may be parking available, but because once you get above 85%, perceptually, I may have to hunt for that spot. It may not be right near my intended destination. It may be around, it may be a little bit farther away. So once I hit that 85% threshold, perceptually, it's essentially full parking. The areas in yellow were the areas from 70 to 84%, and the areas in green and blue are the areas from 50% and on down. Now, again, this is peak hour. Now, one of the other things that we also look at is you have various different uses, and they may not necessarily peak at the time coinciding with the overall peak on the north side or south side of the track. So one of the other things we look at is the parking areas is the highest occupancy that they achieve throughout the day. And you see a lot of areas at some point they exceeded that 85% threshold, and it does include both on-street and off-street spaces. So if you're going to one of those destinations over by in one of these other areas, it may be fine during the peak hour, but again in the evening, and just as an example, the area around the theater, they may have hit this at 7 o'clock at night when they're showing. At 12 o'clock in the afternoon, there's not a problem there.
Excuse me, the green, I can't read the green is what percentage?
The green, that would be from 65 to 75.
Okay.
We also broke out the commuter parking occupancy, and of the 921 spaces that we analyzed, we were peaking at about 850 of those. And we see that peak is occurring by about 9 o'clock in the morning. We're getting very close to that and holding steady throughout much of the day. Now, one of the interesting things that what we went back and looked at is one of the questions that we asked commuters is, what time do you board the trains? And one of the interesting things that we found from this was by about 8:15 in the morning, of the daily boardings, the morning boardings that were provided to us by Metra, and this is based on 2006 figures of about 2,300 boardings per day, by 8:15, 97% have said they're there for the train. So most of those boardings have taken place by the time we're reaching 8:15. And what's interesting is the commuter spaces are held until noon, where we've got most of our daily commuters in much earlier than that. And one of the other things that we did is we broke out the parking between that which is publicly available And the 1,810 of the spaces that we analyzed, the 1539 line is about 85%. And you see we are very close to that overall within the downtown for the percentage of public parking which is occupied. When we break this down for the parking on the north side of the tracks, again, this is public parking. Out of the 364 public spaces on the north side of the tracks, we're peaking at about 275 spaces, whereas on the south side of the track, 1229 would be our 85% figure, and we're actually exceeding that. Looking at the private parking downtown, this is where we're actually seeing the surplus capacity. Out of the 1,255 spaces, we're only peaking about 700 spaces. And again, that's understandable, a private landowner, business owner, and much of this could include areas like the AT&T lot, which was in our study area. That's a large lot that is vacant. The funeral home, when we were doing our study, there was no occupancy in areas like that. And it's understandable. A private business owner, he may have 10 spaces. He's only using 2 or 3. He's not opening those up to other businesses. And I made the comment to the steering committee this morning, there was a few areas around town that have signs. I mean, basically don't even think of parking here if you're not coming to this business. And, you know, we see that in a number of downtowns. Some probably are, you know, understandably, they're very protective of the parking they have for their customers. And again, just breaking this down from north of the tracks and south of the tracks, again, the private supply, we do see surplus capacity in those spaces. So it's really the public that we're finding stressed. We also looked at the parking garage and we broke down the results by parking level. And one of the interesting things that we saw here was the 4-hour spaces, which is the blue line. Those are on the ground level of the deck. Those don't start to get really busy until late in the evening. During much of the day, we did find spaces available for that. The employee spaces, which is the second level of the deck, is hitting about 80% of those spaces occupied. And for those, our understanding is businesses or individual employees will purchase a permit in order to park on those spaces. The daily fee spaces, which is essentially levels 3 and 4 of the garage, is achieving essentially 100% by 9 o'clock in the morning. Very heavily used by commuters. And then the top level, which is a Lot S permit, and then after 8 o'clock is available for daily fee parking, is also achieving about 95% very early in the day. And what we found overall was the parking garage was achieving about 90% occupancy. So actually it is very well used. Now, one of the other things that we were looking at was turnover, and that is simply an indication of the average number of different vehicles that will use spaces. So, for example, if we have 30 cars, 30 different cars found in 10 spaces over the course of 8, or in our case it was 17 hours, you would have a 3-time turnover. One of the misleading things about turnover, however, is you can have a turnover number that can be low for 2 reasons. One is because you have few vehicles using those spaces, so you're going to have a low turnover. You could also have a low turnover because those cars are staying for an extended period of time. Again, it's few cars being able to get into those spaces. So one of the things that we did look at was in the various parking spaces, we came by and we saw how the spaces were being used. And what we did was the areas in pink are the areas that we consider in violation. And what I did is the areas where it's starting after 3 would be a spot that is a 2-hour time limited space. And I said, conceivably, I could see a car there 3 times. He might have pulled in just before I got there the first time. When I come by an hour again, he's still going to be there. When I come by the 3rd time, he could be there because he overstayed by a few minutes and could be leaving after that. So potentially 3 times a car could be there. So what we found, and then the area right here, these are the spaces in front of the post office. Because those are time limited to 20 minutes, I shouldn't see that car more than once. And so we saw any cars that stayed 2 times or more, we considered in violation. What we found from this analysis was only about 6% of the vehicles, and this is on the Thursday survey date, were in violation of what we considered based on the criteria I just mentioned, which is actually pretty good. We have a benchmark of what we like to see is no more than 5%. So it's actually folks are adhering to the time limits essentially from what we were seeing. When we looked at the occupancy results, this is broken out for Saturday, we see a much lower occupancy than what we saw on the Thursday survey date, peaking in only about 1,216. In the morning, we had the day of the farmer's market, so we see that morning peak. Breaking the results out by north and south of the tracks, that bump on the north side of the tracks is understandable given the Tivoli Theater with the nighttime. We saw a lot of activity, and so that would have the bump there. And on the south side, we had that initial peak with the farmer's market, and then generally a steady or general decline throughout the rest of the day. Again, public supply on the north side of the tracks for Saturday, and the public supply on the south side of the tracks for Saturday. Again, well below our thresholds compared to what we were finding. And again, we don't have the impact of the commuters on the Saturday that we would have on a Thursday. This is the peak hour for the Saturday. Again, you see some areas that are very highly utilized. The area around the library during the peak hour, that was full, and a few other areas. And when we look at the peak achieved, again, we have a few more areas that are stressed, but not nearly what we were seeing on the Thursday survey date. And again, the occupancy, the turnover on the Saturday. And one of the things that we noticed here is we have nearly the same number of cars, but our percentage of violations went from 6% to about 10%. And what we're expecting is probably what we think is happening there is it's more than likely employees who are taking those on-street spaces because they know there's not enforcement on Saturday. So they'll take the more convenient on-street spaces, you know, either right across from their business or right down the street from their business. And one of the things that we feel is that's really detrimental to the customers because the on-street parking really should be the lifeblood of the downtown. One of the other things that we think may be happening, and this could be keeping this violation rate down a little bit, is, I actually did observe it as I was doing some of my other field work. I would notice folks come out, an employee, get into their car and move it a few spaces. They may have pulled out of one lot and then pulled into another space, and so we call that the 2-hour shuffle. That car actually would not, if they did that within the 2 hours, that would not be in our violation. But we did see that occurring. Now, as I mentioned, one of the other things that we did is we have a model that we developed, the parking for the Tivoli Theater. It's based on the capacity of the theater right now, which is just over 1,000 seats. And what we calculated, and this is looking at a recent summertime matinee, what we calculated during the day was we had a daytime need when they'd have a matinee of about 200 spaces, and looking at what is in the Tivoli building lot and then any available capacity in the commuter lots or the other public parking that would be nearby, we total about 100 spaces. So they would actually be a deficit of about 100 spaces. You see that's actually better during the evening hours when it would be more heavily utilized because more of those commuter spaces are going to be opened up and available to them. He's not competing as he might be during the early afternoon hours. And just what I did, this is based on an 85% drive and park, and what that came up was the 289 calculated demand. What that came up to was a 0.29 spaces per seat. I compared that, ITE, which is Institute of Transportation Engineers, they've done a number of studies at various theaters, and their average for a theater with matinees on a weekday would be 0.26. So we're actually very close to that. Just some of the other things that we noticed, the parking garage fine, the sign, some of the comments that we received, some folks find that confusing, and our initial feeling here is this sign is really kind of upside down. I mean, level 1 should be at the bottom, and level 2, 3, 4 going up, because that's where the parking is. So it's actually a little confusing to folks. The signs need to be clear. The Forest Lot North, it says shop or CBD permit, but one of the interesting things that we found here was within those circles, hidden behind the trees, are the signs that say free 3-hour parking. So it's things like that that we think, you know, for folks, they really have to be able to easily understand where they can park. They pull into that lot, and there's a lot of areas that are signed as CBD employee permit, and then we find here is the signs for the 3-hour work. We're actually not clear. What What I found interesting here was we have a say left steep commuter and then a very small 2-hour free parking lot. And then this sign right here is a sign that's pointing to the parking garage, but you can't see it, it's hidden behind the phone pole. Just another indication of signs. We're somewhat consistent with the logo with the P inside the circle, but we've got a round sign followed by rectangular signs. And it's just our feeling, one of our initial findings is signs really need to be consistent, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. It's just, you know, you're trying to direct folks where the parking needs to be, and there's a hierarchy of signs, but try to identify one type so they know what they're looking for. Just some finding summaries. The public supply is stressed when we're achieving the 85% occupancy. 58% of the parking on the south side is publicly available versus only 41% on the north side of the tracks. Enforcement today with only the 6% violation is working well, but we will be thinking of some changes that may require some additional staffing in order to eliminate that 2-hour employee shuffle. We received a number of comments, both in some of the stakeholder meetings we had in the comments. Short-term, 10 to 15-minute parking is needed. You have a number of businesses with bakeries, dry cleaners, and those kinds of things that would like the parking convenient, close where they can run in, conduct their business, and be right back out and not want to have to circle the block 5 times. Signs, we think, could be a little bit better. There was also some confusion on, you have some valet operations around town, and there's some confusion as to those spaces when they're available and who they're available for. One of the questions that we were asked was if we could encourage commuters to not park at the Main Street station and go to either Fairmont or Belmont. And just looking at even a 5% reduction in the number of commuters would provide about 40 additional spaces in the downtown that could be used either for employee parking to get them off the streets or other additional customer parking. As I indicated before, commuter spaces could potentially be opened up prior to 12 noon, seeing that most of them are already here much earlier than that. So if there are those spaces, to make efficient use of those, open those up earlier than that. We did find the library as a destination, and you do not have any designated library spaces. Folks going to the library are competing with anybody else parking in that lot, so there was a lot of frustration in the comments from that. As I indicated, the employees parking on the street, and the time limits appeared to be appropriate. One of the surveys that we found was 57% of folks said they were here for 2 hours or less, and I believe it was 94% are here for 3 hours or less. So the time limits we have between the on-street and the various off-street spaces appear to be appropriate to accommodate most folks' business. The surplus capacity is primarily in the private spaces. The Tivoli Theater during the daytime hours may be short, and it's probably not as much of an issue during the evening when those commuter spaces are available. Parking for downtown employees, if they don't have private parking, they're competing with commuters for parking, and in fact 6% of the employees indicated that they do park in on-street spaces in the employee surveys. One of the other questions asked was, right now the top level of the deck, which is Lot S, or it is opened up to daily fee, but it's not until after 8 a.m. A number of commuters asked why they couldn't be opened up before that. In some of the conversations that I have, and you saw that the occupancy of the daily fee spaces is full very early in the day. Our feeling is if we open up that top level of the deck, it's going to be full of commuters, and an employee who may arrive at 9 or 9:30 to start work, then where are they going to park? There are a number of businesses that they don't want to pay for a permit for a part-time employee. He might only be here once or twice a week. Employee doesn't want to pay the quarterly charge for parking there. So our feeling right now is that parking should not be opened up earlier.
Just in furthering the discussion about the signs, and we're going to develop the best practices, and we have a slide presentation on that. But one of the big things is signage and the ability for a customer or visitor to find a place to park. And we've developed this hierarchy of 4 signs for vehicle wayfinding, and the 5th is the pedestrian. So once the driver transitions from a parked vehicle, we need to provide them signage to get to the major destinations on the major streets. And so that's our fifth sign. These are examples of signs that, that we've kind of established for best practice. This first sign here is really the introduction sign and is used to tell people what sign to look for parking as they're going around the downtown. You kind of do that, as Dave pointed out, the Circle P. There just needs to be a consistency with that. The directional sign to where parking is. You do that for the parking deck, kind of, sort of. There's signs that begin, for example, they lead you going eastbound on Curtis, and it points this way to parking and the parking deck down below. But after a block, there's no more signs that tell you the parking deck is still another block further down. And there's no visual cue of being able to see the parking deck because it's back behind buildings. So there's recommendations for signage like that we're going to be making. One of the biggest things, though, is identifying then the parking lot and or the parking area. Here we basically do it based upon the lot from a permit standpoint. But if I'm trying to direct a customer visitor to a public parking area, and I'm a merchant, I'm not sure where I would tell them to park, because that a lot sign, as you saw, is for permit, and then the 2 hour down below, that a connection is not made with the person who's not here every day. So the thought process is, and we highly recommend it, is that you name the lot, the letters are fine, but that we actually make that as a parking identification sign, describe what parking is available in that lot before they get into the lot, and then, as Dave pointed out, more clearly define the spaces in the parking lot. And finally, identifying where parking is can be incorporated into other wayfinding signs for vehicles. Again, as we said, we're very concerned about the pedestrian activity because that is very important. Believe it or not, the parking deck does a pretty good job of getting people, after they exit their vehicle, there are great pedestrian pathways to get to the main streets. That works well. There's not the wayfinding signs there, but at least you have the paths, and so that's important. We went through all of the parking areas and did sort of a review of those. And there's concerns about some of your parking lots in terms of lighting and security. And as you begin to rely upon these lots for the nighttime activities, your restaurants, your entertainment venues, best practice is really to light these lots. In some cases, the vegetation, which is great, it happens to soften the parking lot. However, conversely, it provides a hiding space for someone. So if I'm getting out of my car and there's this tall landscape or thick landscape there, and it's at night, I'm wondering, could there be someone back there? There may not be the problem here, but it's the perception that we're concerned about. So we've gone through and looked at those types of things for the parking lots, as well as the condition of the lots, and we're going to have some recommendations for those. I think we've really talked about that.
As I indicated, this is really just it's a first blush to put some information out in front of you folks to get some feedback. We still have a fair amount of work to do. One of the things, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have to do what we call our parking demand calculations, which is generating the number of parking spaces needed by land use and then correlating that to what we are seeing, so that we can see is how much parking do we need now, and then also be able to project this parking in the future as occupancy increases, as the downtown grows, if new development comes in and that kind of thing. We have to get into a little more detail on a number of the recommendations. Is that we have this is basic information that we have, but it's going through this information and from that formulating some recommendations that we can put in front of you folks and then ultimately village council. So there is a fair amount of work to do yet.